After so many years of underwhelming entries, Battlefield has finally made a strong comeback with Battlefield 6. This marks a mighty return to form for the franchise, and it's by far the biggest Battlefield game to date, hitting over 700,000 concurrent players on Steam within 24 hours of its debut. Technically speaking, just like previous entries, Battlefield 6 runs on DICE's in-house Frostbite engine, with a strong emphasis on delivering fast, smooth, and stable performance. To achieve this, DICE relied heavily on traditional rendering techniques, and there are no advanced or flashy features like ray tracing or virtualized geometry here. Visually, Battlefield 6 is somewhat inconsistent. On the plus side, destructions and explosions are dialed up to 11 compared to previous entries, and they look spectacular on both the single-player campaign and online multiplayer, filling the screen with tons of visual effects, particles, and physicalized debris. Additionally, the game's global illumination looks beautiful on certain maps and scenes, and in some spots it even manages to mimic RTGI-style local bounce lighting with impressive success. However, in other areas the indirect lighting doesn't hold up as well. Many objects are left unshaded and light leaking become quite noticeable, and the choice of color grading on certain maps further detracts from the visual presentation. That said, due to the chaotic and fast-paced nature of the gameplay, there is little time to admire the scenery or notice these visual drawbacks. Performance-wise, as expected, the game is very stable and runs extremely well, but to achieve a high refresh rate experience, you'll need a strong CPU, as the game can easily saturate most processors, especially 6-core chips like the Ryzen 5 3600. Here, in a custom CPU stress test I created using Battlefield Portal, the 5700X3D delivers up to 53% higher performance compared to the 3600. And I am focusing on CPU performance here because while the graphics menu offers plenty of settings, as we'll see later in the video, most of them primarily affect GPU performance and offer limited scalability on the CPU side. Just like previous Battlefield games, the engine supports custom commands to adjust certain rendering parameters. Using these commands is pretty straightforward. Go to the games folder, create a new text file and name it user.cfg. If you can't see the file extension or the .txt part of the name, click here, go to Options, View, and check Hide Extensions for non-file types and click Apply. Once that's done, open the file with any text editor and here you can enter all the commands you want to use. Since we've been talking about CPU performance, let's start with these commands. And credit goes to Minidot for the original video. I recommend checking it out for more details. Here, using both the 5700X3D and 3600, we can see that CPU usage and temps are lower when these commands are applied, but performance actually drops, especially on the 3600. Frame times are also less consistent, which is more obvious here where the frame time graph is thicker and shows more variation. Now, many users report that these commands can improve performance while significantly lowering CPU usage and temps. So I recommend giving them a try and tell us in the comments if you noticed any improvements.
Take out that armor before it wipes us out!
Now the game includes a post-processing quality setting, but its impact is minimal. It only slightly changes the lens flare effect, as you can see here. Performance-wise, it has no significant impact and it doesn't change anything about the depth of field effect. Fortunately, we can disable it using this command, which noticeably improves visibility. And DICE should consider adding in-game menu options to toggle depth of field and other post-processing effects. The last command I want to talk about is this one, which has the biggest visual impact. It essentially disables all dynamic lights, and its effect is most noticeable here in the firing range, which is filled with local light sources. As you can see, it can deliver a massive performance improvement, but I'd recommend using it only as a last resort, since it can significantly reduce visibility. Another way to boost performance on Battlefield 6 is through upscaling technologies. The game natively supports DLSS for transformer model with preset K, and as expected, this gives DLSS a massive image quality advantage over FSR3 and XeSS. But it comes with a slightly higher performance cost, at least compared to FSR3. Surprisingly, FSR3 in this game delivers a fairly stable image, but it's also the softest of the three. XeSS appears a bit sharper, but it's less stable and suffers from noticeable shimmering as you can see here. At native resolution we see similar results, and performance-wise DLAA is the fastest option, but it produces poor image quality and it looks blurry, wiping out much of the fine detail. It's best avoided as even the upscaling option looks significantly better in my opinion. There is also an option to disable anti-aliasing entirely, which gives a slight performance boost over DLAA. Moving on to future frame rendering. When enabled, this option allows the CPU to prepare and queue upcoming frames while the GPU is still rendering the current one. And my testing enabling future frame rendering did not result in any performance improvement or noticeable increase in visual smoothness. The only real difference was higher CPU usage and, more importantly, an increase in overall PC latency. So in general, I recommend leaving this option disabled, since anything that increases latency should be avoided in a game like this. Let's move on to texture quality. Battlefield 6 includes an optional HD texture pack that can be installed separately. And what I noticed is that if texture quality is set to high or above while the HD pack is not installed, the game crashes when loading any map. This indicates that the HD textures are automatically enabled when using high, ultra, or overkill. Visually, the difference between these three options is minimal, despite the noticeable increase in VRAM usage when going up to ultra or overkill. Another thing I noticed is that with Ultra and Overkill, there is sometimes a sudden spike in VRAM usage in certain areas, which could suggest a potential VRAM leak issue with these options. On 8GB GPUs like the 3060 Ti, we can see frequent stuttering and performance drops when using Ultra or Overkill, even though the reported VRAM usage looks normal. High can also push VRAM usage close to 8GB in some areas, especially in the single-player campaign. So generally for 8GB GPU, I recommend keeping texture quality at high, and if you start noticing stuttering or sudden performance drops, switch to low instead. For higher VRAM GPUs, I'd still recommend avoiding Ultra and Overkill, since they significantly increase VRAM usage without offering any meaningful visual improvement. There is also a setting for texture filtering, and here Ultra and Overkill noticeably improve distant texture sharpness compared to the lower options. And as usual, the performance cost of texture filtering is negligible, so I recommend leaving it at Ultra or Overkill. Moving on to mesh quality, this one controls the level of detail and raw distance of in-game objects as you can see here, and it affects both close range and distant meshes, and lowering it introduces some noticeable pop-in, but even at higher settings pop-in is still present. As I mentioned earlier, the game settings don't offer much CPU scalability, and this is one of the reasons why. Normally mesh quality should have a clear impact on CPU performance, but even when going from low to overkill, the difference isn't massive on the 5700X3D, and we can see a smaller gap when using the slower 3600 as you can see here. I also tested this setting on different maps such as Manhattan Bridge, and again the performance difference wasn't huge. Still, I wouldn't recommend setting it to overkill, especially if you're running a weaker CPU. Keeping it at medium or high is a better balance as it can still impact CPU performance on certain maps or under specific conditions. Next we have terrain quality. This one controls the bump and parallax mapping of ground surfaces. Both medium and high add more depth and surface detail to the terrain. Performance-wise, this one doesn't have a significant impact, so I recommend keeping it at high.
We gotta move.
Let's move on to Undergrowth Quality. This one is supposed to adjust the density of ground elements like vegetation, rocks, and other small objects. However, after testing it on both campaign and multiplayer maps, I couldn't notice any visual difference. Performance is also identical between low and high, so I recommend leaving this one at high. Let's move on to effects quality. This one controls the density and quality of visual effects like particles. The difference between low and high is minimal. In most cases, you'll just see few more particles and debris at high. Here, the smoke and fire effects look almost identical, with the only noticeable change being the particles from the electrical sparks, which are missing when using low. Performance-wise, in the first scene, there is only a small 2 to 4% difference between low and high. But in the second one, the impact is much larger, around a 12% drop. Therefore, I recommend keeping this one at low. Up next is volumetric quality. This setting controls the resolution and detail of volumetric effects and lighting, as you can see here with these light shafts. Performance-wise in this scene, there is only a small impact, around 3 to 5% difference when going from low to ultra. But I don't recommend using ultra as it can have a larger impact in volumetric heavy areas, and it's better to keep this one at high. Moving on to lighting quality, this setting only affects certain maps and areas, with high improving the quality and accuracy of the indirect lighting and ambient shading, and it doesn't have any noticeable performance impact, so I recommend leaving it at high. Next we have local light and shadow quality. This one affects shadows cast by artificial lights, and it has three main visual impacts. First, it controls the quality of these shadows, with a noticeable improvement when going from low to high, but no visible gain when moving to overkill. Second, it determines the number of local shadows, as you can see here, and once again, there is no visual difference between high and overkill. Third, it affects the draw distance of these shadows, and here we finally see a difference where overkill renders more distant shadows compared to high. Performance-wise, there is about a 3% cost when going from low to high, and roughly 8% when pushing it to overkill. However, that's not all. This setting can also increase VRAM usage noticeably, especially when using overkill. Therefore, I recommend keeping this one at high. Let's move on to sun shadow quality. This one mainly affects shadows cast by the sun and moon. Increasing it adds slightly more shadow detail and improves the softness of the shadows. It also extends the cascade range, making distant shadows more detailed, as you can see here. Performance-wise, this setting is demanding. In the campaign under worst-case conditions, there is about a 4% cost when going from low to medium, 11% when going to high, 28% when going to ultra, and 34% when going to overkill. On some multiplayer maps, the performance cost is less severe but still noticeable, so I recommend keeping this one at medium or high. To filter these shadows, the game offers two options, PCF and PCSS. In my testing, switching between the two did not make any noticeable difference in the campaign. It only matters on multiplayer maps where PCSS produces more realistic softer shadows compared to PCF and helps hide the low resolution of the shadow maps. However, it also introduces more shadow noise and artifacts, as you can see here. And performance-wise, there is a small difference between the two options. Ultimately, this setting comes down to personal preference, so choose the option that best suits your visual preference. Next, we have reflections quality. This one controls the resolution and quality of cube map reflections, as you can see here. And performance-wise, these reflections are not demanding and have no significant impact, so keep them at high. We also have screen space reflections, which as its name indicates controls the quality and accuracy of SSR. The only notable issue with these reflections is that when running the game at lower resolutions or using aggressive upscaling, SSR can introduce noise and artifacts on glossy surfaces. In terms of performance, enabling SSR costs around 4%. So if the noise from these reflections bothers you, you can turn them off completely, otherwise it's best to keep them at high. Moving on to screen space AO and GI. We have three main options here. We can turn off ambient occlusion entirely, which makes the scene look flat and less grounded. Next, there is GTAO, which does a decent job at grounding the scene but tends to overshade, creating a dark halo around many objects. Finally, we have SSGI or Screen Space Global Illumination, which produces more natural and softer shading, but comes with a significant performance cost, as you can see here. SSGI low costs around 12%, SSGI high about 20%, while GTAO has a much smaller 4% impact. In other scenes, the performance hit is lower, but overall I recommend keeping this one at GTAO high. And if you prefer SSGI, avoid using the high option since it offers no visual improvement over SSGI low. Lastly, we have High Fidelity Objects Amount. This one controls the update rate and fluidity for vehicles and infantry animations. It mainly affects bots and AI soldiers that are near the edges of the camera or farther away in the distance. Performance-wise, even when the CPU is under heavy load, the impact is relatively small, around 4 to 8% when going from low to ultra on the 5700 X3D and 3600. So similar to mesh quality, I recommend keeping this one at medium or high to avoid any potential CPU performance issues. So given everything we've discussed so far, these are my recommended settings for Battlefield 6. Now let's compare the optimized settings against the Overkill preset at 1440p using DLSS quality. I am using low textures here to avoid any potential VRAM issues when testing the Overkill preset. Let's start with the third mission of the campaign, which is one of the most demanding sections for both the CPU and GPU. Here we can see an average performance improvement of around 30% when using the optimized settings. Next, let's move to some multiplayer matches where I switched to DLSS balanced instead. Testing performance here and getting comparable footage was tricky due to the number of variations that naturally occurs during matches. And since I am terrible at this game, I kept getting wiped out by players and bots, which constantly changed my location on the map. It's also worth mentioning that I tested both optimized and overkill preset within the same match. Here on Manhattan Bridge, we can see a similar 30% improvement as in the campaign, while here on Cairo the gap widens significantly, reaching around 50%. Before ending the video, I want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon. If you are able and would like to directly support my work, consider becoming a patron to get access to the highest possible quality of my latest videos, including this one. And a big thank you to all my supporters, and thanks to you as well for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and if not, leave a dislike. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next one.